I'm really happy, honored to introduce Quinn Mecham. Could go on for some time. I'm going to try to keep it somewhat brief because we want to hear from him, not for me. I have known Quinn for some time. Something you may not know about Quinn is that before he went over to the dark side, by which I mean political science, he was a comparative literature student, right? The only true and living discipline on the face of the earth. And he was a student in, I think, 2 of my classes. Will not surprise you to know that he was an excellent student. Following his graduation, he attended Stanford University, where he earned both his master's and doctoral degrees in political science. And before coming to teach in BYU in 2013, so just over 10 years ago, he had many different adventures, you might say. He taught at George Washington University and Middlebury College. He's also been an Academy Scholar at Harvard University, as well as a Franklin Fellow in Policy Planning at the U.S. State Department. He worked for McKinsey & Company as well for 2 years. In addition to all of those things, he's a well-published and important scholar, the author of an important book on the institutional origins of Islamist political mobilization, which was published a few years ago from Cambridge University Press, as well as numerous articles in important peer-reviewed journals. Quinn, in other words, is a multifaceted thinker, teacher, and administrator, and I am frequently surprised by the reach and range of his interests. Recently, for example, when I was asking a question about Taylor Swift, it may now be a requirement at every meeting of any kind, you have to mention Taylor Swift, right, in some context. But anyway, he told me that I should check out his curated list of his favorite Taylor Swift songs on Spotify. This is in one of several lists, evidently, involving several of his favorite artists. He's also run an informal club on foreign cinema for interested students as he curates foreign films and offers commentary and discussion. He has run for Orem City Council, unfortunately unsuccessfully, but he's also an avid hiker, a runner, and just a general adventurer. Many of you may have attended his talk just recently on tips for travel, and of course he's very well qualified to offer advice on that as well, as not too long ago he fulfilled his goal of visiting 100 countries before he turned 50. But over the last few years, I have had the privilege of working with him here at the Kennedy Center. For the first few years, I was serving in Quinn's current position, as I was the associate director in charge of academics, and Quinn was the coordinator of our Middle East Studies Arabic, or MESA program. And I was constantly amazed at what he was doing to improve and transform that program and make it the best possible program for his students. So when I was appointed as the director of the Kennedy Center and was looking for a new associate director, I immediately thought of Quinn. Thankfully, he accepted. He's a remarkable faculty member and administrator, always looking for ways to improve things for the students and faculty under his charge. I have also learned through many conversations over the years that he is a deeply spiritual man, and in his quiet way is a great example of a disciple scholar. And so we decided that when we wanted to have a series, at least once a semester, in which we had a lecture by a disciple scholar, we thought of Quinn as the ideal person to inaugurate this series. So please join me in thanking Quinn and welcoming to this lecture.
That was very kind, Stan. Thank you. I'm so pleased to be here with you today. It's really meaningful to me to speak on today's topic at BYU, which has established a community and a culture that is committed to the process of spiritual development, and particularly to speak on this topic at the Kennedy Center, which is dedicated, I think, in all respects to the motto that you see up here on the screen, expand your world. And this talk today is about why and how we might expand our world, as I focus on the spiritual foundations of curiosity. Now, I'm grateful to those with the foresight and faith to imagine the possibility of the James Webb Space Telescope, which was envisioned more than 20 years ago and launched at the end of 2021, when much of the world still felt very closed off in a global pandemic. It started to send back pictures to us to view in 2022. When you look carefully at this particular photo that I've put up on the screen, what do you think about? What do you feel? If you look carefully, you might start to notice that this is not just a collection of stars, like those we see in our own night sky, but that this is a picture deep into space of entire galaxies, each of them filled with stars, spinning and whirling with infinite possibilities. You might also begin to say to yourself, wow, this raises a lot of questions about who I am and what matters to me. Let's zoom in just a little bit. Again, this is a slightly more close-up view of one of those spinning galaxies, the Carina Nebula, taken by the Webb Space Telescope. What about when we look at this close-up, which of course is still larger than we can possibly imagine? This nebula full of cosmic dust and matter and planets and beauty and possibility that shatters the idea of our own self-importance and reframes, I think, quite profoundly our personal worries, including the ones we have today, and our own personal stories. And I think it places them on a much grander palette. So my topic today is curiosity. What is curiosity? And I did not take those Webb Space Telescope pictures, but I'm going to be sharing with you largely photos that I've taken recently as we go on this journey together a little bit. Curiosity to me is wondering why the world around us is the way that it is, and why our lived experience in this world happens the way that it does. A mindset of curiosity is a mindset based in the belief that the world and our experience in it are full of surprises and full of wonder. It is a mindset that is open to being surprised, maybe along the way a little disoriented, and delighted at the possibility of discovery. When we have a mindset of curiosity, we recognize our own limitations and our own challenges and our own limited view as we seek to understand the truth. We know, as Paul suggests in his letter to the Corinthians, that we understand but a very little part of the world and of the deeper truths that shape our experience. In other words, that we see through a glass darkly. And this is where scholarship comes in. I believe that at its foundation, scholarship is simply the act of asking a puzzling question and then seeking to the best of our ability ways in which we try to answer it. It is, if that is a process that gives you energy, then the university is a great place for you to be. But scholarship is not just a vocation or something that you are required to do on your way to the completion of a university degree. I believe that the process of asking a thoughtful question and finding your way in a direction toward an answer is actually a spiritual act. This is a picture of Emerson Hall in Harvard Yard. Emerson Hall is named after one of my spiritual heroes, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and it houses the Harvard Philosophy Department. This building played a role in my education, most often just by simply walking past it, full of worries and concerns about my day-to-day activities, and looking up and observing David's powerful question recorded in Psalm 8, verse 4, that is engraved on the top of this building. You might be able to see it up there above the pillars. It says, "What is man, that thou art mindful of him?" And as far as I know, the faculty in that building have not definitively answered that question. But it is the kind of question that has spiritual power because it forces us to confront the deeper possibilities within ourselves. It is what I would call a spiritually productive puzzle. The art of asking and then opening yourself up to being surprised by the answers you get is a spiritual practice. The act of asking allows you to exercise agency and gives you practice developing a number of spiritual virtues, including two that I think are really critical to asking good questions, and those are faith and humility. In the Christian tradition, like most religious traditions, the great leaders of our tradition have built a tradition around asking great questions. Jesus is an exemplar here. In the New Testament, he asks more than 300 questions. Most of those questions are open-ended, and they are designed to force the listener to grapple with that question before he himself ever moves in to try to provide an answer. At least 80 of those 300 plus questions begin with the words how or why, and they are challenging questions. Let me give you a few of my favorites. Unto what shall I liken the kingdom of God? But whom say ye that I am? For what is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Or what shall a man give in exchange for his soul? Why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? Which now of these three, thinkest thou, was neighbor unto him that fell among the thieves? Were there not 10 cleansed? But where are the 9? Notably, in the New Testament, Jesus doesn't ask when questions. When is not a big part of his repertoire. He asks why. He asks how. He asks questions that force us to grapple with the puzzle of our own agency and the relationship between agents who are exercising that agency in proximity to one another. In the words of my colleague, Jamin Rowan, he is, in that New Testament record, the curious Christ. Other great religious leaders are also some of the best among us at asking questions. They do not just make definitive pronouncements. Think of the way, for example, that Joseph Smith's personal question as a teenager invited a spiritual revolution, or how his cries from Liberty Jail later in life, "O God, where art thou? And where is the pavilion that covereth thy hiding place?" Questions like that led to a flood of spiritual energy and revelation. So that brings me to our core topic. What are the spiritual foundations of curiosity? This is far from a definitive examination, and I'm just daring, I think, to crack into a few thoughts on this topic. But I'd like to start with some proposals. Let's start with faith. Sometimes we imagine that faith and doubt are somehow opposites. But I have come to believe over time that they are mutually codependent. For me, certainty is more fittingly on the opposite pole from faith. To act in faith requires the acknowledgement of the possibility of doubt. I act in faith not because there is no doubt, but because of the presence of doubt. The critical distinction between faith and doubt, therefore, is not so much that they are distinct from one another. It is in their implications for action. Faith is a principle of action, while doubt predisposes us to inaction. So to ask a question and be open to the possibility of a range of answers is necessarily an act of faith. We may or may not find the answer that we seek, but by asking the question, we indicate that we are using our agency through a belief in the possibility of an answer, and therefore we act on a presumption of that possibility. An adjacent Christian virtue to that of faith is that of hope. This comes out in Paul. I think curiosity is a natural output of a hope for a better world. Even if my faith in finding an answer to my question is limited, I can look forward with hope that perhaps my question matters, that my methods of answering that question might work, and that whatever answer I find might help actually make the world more comprehensible, more meaningful, and potentially even a better place. So let's now turn to two adjacent virtues that are more outward-looking and focus our inquiry on others. Charity is one of these. It comes often in that triad of faith, hope, and charity, and I'm going to add empathy next to this. When we are curious about other people and the way that they behave and the way that they believe, we learn to understand them better, and as we understand other people better, we naturally develop more concern and more love for those outside of ourselves. I believe that the act of asking questions is an act of love towards the created world. It's a way in which we exercise charity and recognize that the world is beyond us and that we have the potential to love it, including those around us that are in it. When we are open to empathy, the process of getting beyond the lenses that shape our own worldview and start seeing the world through the eyes of another, we are also better able to exercise curiosity. What is it about this person or their behavior that is foreign to my experience? Why do they behave that way when I would behave this way? Why is this story meaningful to them, but not yet meaningful to me? These are the questions driven by empathy that expand our worldview and open us up to the possibilities of things that we have not yet imagined. I'm going to add two more. I also think that these are adjacent virtues. I call them integrity and humility. These are also foundational virtues that enable a life of curiosity. And for me, integrity means being honest about the way that you ask questions, about being honest about what you find when you ask those questions. And that's particularly important even when the answers are at least initially unappealing. Integrity opens up the possibility of a world of wonder and surprise and helps us to avoid confirming our own biases as we look for evidence that aligns with our pre-existing worldview. Similarly, humility is what I see as a final and critical spiritual foundation for curiosity. It starts with a recognition that our understanding is deeply incomplete, that we do indeed see through a glass darkly. It means that we have an openness to being wrong about the world and a willingness to do the hard work to continually update our worldview, to enrich it and make it more truthful, and to live according to greater truth. I believe that genuine humility is more likely to produce good answers and much more likely to lead to creative insights that transform the world and transform how we see our role in that world. Underlying all of these foundational virtues of curiosity, I think, requires an attitude of patience and a comfort with mystery, in which we recognize that our timelines are often very artificial, they are not eternal, and that quality answers to our quality questions take time. They take iteration. They take a lot of hard work to unfold. So a mindset of curiosity is fundamentally a mindset that's open to the world, that is a growth mindset, that expands our belief in greater possibilities than we currently comprehend. I think this raises an important question that we all will face as we ask great, meaningful, puzzling questions in our scholarship and beyond. What happens when we ask a question and we get back, I'm going the wrong way, and we get back information that doesn't conform with our current worldview? Well, we have some choices to make when that happens. We experience, in this kind of moment, we experience something like what psychologists describe as dissonance. I put it up here on the slide as this moment where we receive dissonant information, and that's a perception of contradictory information with our prior beliefs. And that is by nature uncomfortable. When we experience dissonance, it is not at all uncommon. In fact, it is extremely common to try to avoid that situation and to stop asking that question, because it forces us to confront part of our worldview that may not be fully correct. Even if we can't avoid it and we continue to deal with it, it's not uncommon to try to rationalize the new information so that somehow we tell ourselves a story that this new information does in fact conform to our previous worldview. We may try to reduce the cognitive difficulty or cognitive load of holding beliefs that appear mutually contradictory and that can challenge the views that ground us in our own reality, that ground us in our own story, that ground us in our own sense of who we are and our identity. A mindset of curiosity invites you to go in a different direction. You will still experience that dissonant information, but if you build that mindset of curiosity, we have a different path. We continue to explore that new evidence as an act of faith in the possibility of reaching a more expansive worldview. And because of a conscientious humility, we refuse to take that information too seriously. Because, hey, the world is full of lots of information. And my worldview as it currently exists may not be as rich as I want it to be, and the new information that is coming in to reshape my worldview may or may not be reliable information. So we can't take it too seriously, recognizing that both our initial assumptions as well as our new evidence may be wrong. But what we can do is we can celebrate that moment. And you know you've hit that moment when you feel uncomfortable. And often we don't like to feel uncomfortable. But with genuine curiosity, you recognize that that moment of discomfort has opened up a new possibility in the world for you. That gives you the opportunity to explore, and it gives you the opportunity to change. And as you explore and you change, you grow, and you transform in ways that we understand to be critical as we follow along the gospel path. So finding evidence that does not conform to our expectations is a majestic and even a spiritual moment. It is a moment to celebrate. It opens a portal to a new world. And that new world is one that we do not yet comprehend. A spiritually grounded curiosity allows us to open our arms with joy to receive the new puzzle about the world and delight in its complexity and in its mystery. Moments of dissonance, therefore, are transformed from moments of discomfort to moments of magic, of surprise, of wonder, of possibility, and a confirmation of our faith in a world that is more nuanced and full of possibility than our mind and heart have yet to fully understand. We have just seen into a portal that allows us to enter into that new understanding. In other words, we're just scratching a little bit on that glass that we see through darkly and are getting to see a little bit of light on the other side that may shape how we see the world. But to experience this as joy instead of as terror, we must start with a faith, like Moses or David, that opens us up to the possibility that the world is much more infinitely grand than we currently understand, and that curiosity is the key that allows us to see through different lenses. I'm personally inspired by the story of Moses, reflected in Moses chapter 1, verse 8. Moses looked and beheld the world upon which he was created. And Moses beheld the world and the ends thereof, and all the children of men which are and which were created. And of the same he greatly marveled and wondered. He reflects and says, now for this cause I know that man is nothing, which thing I never had supposed. He then discusses how he learned to see things with new spiritual eyes that his natural eyes could not have beheld. He faced dissonance with his initial worldview. He opened himself up to the possibility of a more majestic creation and was fundamentally transformed in the process. So I'd like to now switch gears a little bit and share a little bit of my own scholarly journey and the way that my worldview has sometimes been challenged and the way that I've grappled with that. What intellectual puzzles do I care about? Well, I have a foundational intellectual motivation, and that is, how do we answer this question? How can we create high-quality communities? In various ways, I've dedicated my research and scholarship to trying to answer this question. Fundamentally, I think I have an underlying belief that we can be better together, that communities of trust elevate our possibilities. I also have a strong personal value embedded in me through my own faith experiences, that everyone deserves an opportunity to thrive, and that we have a mutual obligation to enable each other to thrive. Unfortunately, because of the things that I study and much of the topics that I care about as a political scientist and some of the regions that I spend my time in, I have come to the conclusion that not all of our communities do very well at helping people thrive, at creating networks of trust. And so in my scholarship, I've chosen to explore this particular question in three specific ways. I've often explored it in the context of Muslim majority communities. I increasingly have been exploring it in parts of Europe, as well as Asia, Africa, and even the United States. And the three big areas that I explore in my scholarship are political expression, political institutions, and intergroup relations. All three of these, I believe, are important in answering the question I just framed in terms of how do we help create high-quality communities. So, let me share a few puzzles. As I mentioned, one way of exercising your curiosity is to ask a puzzling question about the world. I have lots of puzzling questions. A very small percentage ever make it into my scholarship. Most of them I've forgotten about by the time I get out of the shower in the morning. But I do have a lot of puzzling questions along the way, and some of them I actually have made part of my professional life. Here are 3 puzzles that I just want to chat with you a little bit about today. Partly because of my own religious background, I'm interested in this question: why is religion politicized in some contexts and not in others? Because I'm a student of Muslim majority countries, I often explore that question in Islamic contexts. A second puzzle: what leads me to trust and participate in my political system? And a third puzzle that I've recently been exploring is this: what happens to me when I suddenly believe I'm no longer in the majority? How do I see myself differently, and how do I behave differently toward my group and toward an outgroup? And I'd just like to take a few minutes on each of these puzzles to illustrate a way in which I've tried to approach answering these questions, some of the evidence that I've seen as I've answered those questions that didn't fit my initial worldview, and how coming and doing the hard work of trying to understand the evidence has helped to reshape my worldview and how I see the world. So, this first question: why is religion politicized in some contexts and not in others? This is actually a recent photo I took from the Grand Mosque in Paris, in France. This is the Grand Mosque in Touba, in Senegal, in West Africa. 2 places that have been interesting for me as I've explored this question. So in my first book, my interest in identity politics led me to ask the following question: why is Islam a major political issue in some places and not in others? I was a student of the Algerian Civil War in North Africa. In the 1990s, Algeria underwent a horrific civil war after an aborted attempt at democratization that killed hundreds of thousands of people, and in which the role of Islam in the state was the central and defining political cleavage for more than a decade. I also was a Fulbright scholar in Turkey, and in Turkey, the role of Islam in politics was more contested, but it was a very interesting place to study this question because depending on the election, we had a high variation in results in terms of whether people chose to vote for Islamically oriented political parties or not. Different parts of that country are more prone to voting for Islamic political parties than others. But I really want to take you on my journey to Senegal in West Africa for a moment. You know, part of the question about why Islam might be more important to some people in some places and not in others could be that Islam is more important to some people than others. So I really wanted to limit my inquiry to places where Islam is a very significant social and religious force. But even there, I discovered that in some places where Islam is the dominant social organizing force, there still aren't Islamic political parties. And Islam is not the defining characteristic of the political cleavages. And that was particularly true in sub-Saharan Africa. Senegal, for example, is one of the most dominantly Muslim countries in sub-Saharan Africa. It has extensive social networks revolving around Islam, but it didn't have any Islamic political parties. People didn't vote so much on the basis of religious claims. And my initial hypothesis in trying to understand this puzzle is that there was something different about West African Islam that made it less open to making claims in the political arena. That somehow Islam in the Middle East that I knew and Islam in West Africa were fundamentally different, and that had political implications. And that seemed plausible given the statistical models that I had developed that included countries in sub-Saharan Africa, which suggested that just being in sub-Saharan Africa made it much less likely that you would politicize your religion. As I explored further, however, I discovered that actually African Islam had a long history of politicization. And African groups at various times and places had adopted Islamic political messaging in ways that I was very familiar with in the Middle East. And I eventually came to believe that the answer to this particular puzzle is that there is a structural difference in the way that Islam was organized in Senegal and in some other countries in Africa that put different Islamic brotherhoods in a creative political tension, a multipolar political world with one another. And that political system with which these Islamic brotherhoods were embedded was held in a very fragile balance that everyone had an interest in preserving. Different groups had very different beliefs than one another, and they were wary of any one group's ability to try to capture the government and to try to introduce Islamic rhetoric in campaigns. As a result, I started noticing that the absence of Islamic political parties was not because there was an absence of people trying. There would be young men that would raise their hand and say, I think this would be a great political platform, I'm going to run on it. And very quickly, Islamic brotherhoods and groups shut them down. They said, I'm sorry, this is going to cause us great problems with the other brotherhoods in the country. They had a political system that was in equilibrium, and they policed themselves in ways that allowed them to maintain that equilibrium. That was not an answer that I could have possibly conceived from a distance. I had started with a very different hypothesis, but as I went through the process of listening and rejecting other plausible answers, it's an answer that I'm glad that I found and has been an influential answer. A second question that inspires me is this: what leads me to trust and participate in my political system? To answer this question, I designed with some of my students an experiment conducted prior to recent elections in the United States, in Hungary, and in the Netherlands, to see if the way in which voters thought about their government was affected by a losing candidate that gives a speech following the election, either supporting the electoral system and the electoral results, or decrying it and criticizing that electoral system and results, asserting that these elections are unreliable and cannot be trusted. I actually ran this experiment before January 6th in the United States, the week before the Trump-Biden election this last time around. And we got some very interesting results. And our hypothesis was that if our respondents were subjected to a speech that was really critical of the electoral system and of the results from an election, that individual would be less likely to trust government. Across voters compared who had a speech given to them that upheld the integrity of the electoral system and results. And we chose to do this experiment in 3 countries with very different electoral systems: the United States, the Netherlands, and Hungary, including, particularly in the Hungarian case where the quality of democracy was in doubt. And while some of our expectations held, we were really quite surprised by a couple of things that have since changed my worldview. First, we were surprised by how much a person's preferred political party and whether that party was in power mattered. It really mattered. It mattered in how much they trusted their political institutions outside of any other ways that we could potentially help them think through the quality of their political institutions. Partisanship in each of these countries where we did our experiments had come to influence voter perceptions of the truth much more than any particular argument about the integrity of elections or the party system. In other words, what the outcome says about my guy turned out to be more important than my concerns about democracy. Second, we were surprised, I think, that we got stunningly similar results from this experiment from both voters in the United States and voters in Hungary. 2 systems that are quite different. They've had different journeys in democracy. And by many people, Hungary is now considered by most to no longer be a real democracy. Right-wing voters in both countries were equally polarized as each other and equally distrustful of our democratic measures. And I think through this process, I've come to understand better in ways that surprised me and transformed how I see the world, the fragility of our democratic institutions and the perils of failing to defend those institutions in what has become a starkly polarized world. Here's a third puzzle. What happens if I believe that I'm no longer in the majority? This is a real puzzle for many people that are facing changes in borders and changing patterns of refugee flows and immigration. It's a question that's animating politics in Europe and in the United States and many places. And in particular, I'm interested in this question: what happens if I perceive a sudden shift in my demographic status? If I was in the majority and now I recognize I'm actually in the minority, how does my identity change? How does my behavior change toward the other group? To answer this question, we did a simple experiment in 5 countries, asking different sets of people to answer questions about their identity and about other groups, but grouping them strategically into different sets of people who thought that their group might be a minority representing 40% of the population, a group of people who believed they were in the majority of 60% of the population, and a group of people who were split right down the middle, recognizing that their group was 50% and an out-group was 50%. We also asked each of these cases of people to distribute political resources in government to their group and to the other group as part of the experiment. And my hypothesis going into this was minorities, because they're minorities, would feel their minority status perhaps more acutely than the other groups. And also people would recognize as they distributed resources that they represent a particular basis of a particular portion of society, and they would distribute resources based on the percentage of the society that they represented. I had some surprises though. First, while my predictions about triggering this minority group identity largely held true, I was surprised that over and over and over again we saw there was absolutely no difference between the group that saw themselves as 40% of the population and the group that saw themselves as 50% of the population. That being technically a minority was no different in people in terms of how they saw themselves than whether or not they were in this very, very fragile equilibrium state with others. They reacted in almost the same ways, that the 60% group generally felt more secure. And also, when they had the opportunity to distribute resources, regardless of what group they were in, the 40% group or the 50% group or the 60% group, they always gave their group more than half the resources, right? That the fact that they recognized that they were a particular part of society and a particular portion of society still did not resolve this broader concern of their own group fragility. Resources became a way of feeling secure, especially when individuals felt that fragility of their group status. And these lessons helped to transform my worldview to recognize that we all feel very fragile in our status, and in the norms of collaboration that we need are so essential to creating a secure environment for us to trust one another. Otherwise, we will watch out just for our own interests. So let me conclude by inviting you to put yourself in question-rich environments. A question-rich environment is not the most comfortable environment that you can find yourself in. It's an environment that requires you to stretch a little bit, maybe go beyond the all-inclusive beach resort on your vacation, and explore the world in ways that allow you to be open to surprises. Question-rich environments are environments where you are engaging with people with different worldviews than you. That will make it a question-rich environment for you. Question-rich environments are those in which the questions have a lot at stake, that invite you to make choices based on the way that you answer those questions. Question-rich environments are environments that you may not have encountered yet, and will require you to have the patience and faith to believe that going out there and seeing different pieces of this great global puzzle that we're in will be enriching for you and not terrorizing. I believe that curiosity acts as a catalyst. It just like a chemical catalyst, triggers a particular set of reactions. Curiosity triggers a particular set of questions, and those questions have the ability to set off a pattern of behavior and choices that we may not yet be able to predict. And in that sense, they can feel a little bit uncertain, but they will be transformative. Just as I imagine that at some point our universe was transformed by a giant catalyst that sent stars and galaxies and creative life spinning around the universe, that you can go through a similar kind of mental process here at BYU as you read, as you explore, as you ask the kind of questions that speak to your heart and to your values, and have the ability to shape the choices you make as you act in faith and as you act in humility. Ultimately, curiosity, I believe, is deeply transforming. We see the horizon differently when we have a world in which curiosity is one of our fundamental practices. And it is a wild and beautiful ride. It is a spiritual act. It is one that requires the spiritual virtues we went through, that require us to love in different ways, that require us to act in faith and not be paralyzed by doubt, and that require us to fundamentally recognize our possibility while being humble about what we currently understand. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you have a great day.